When the dust settles over broken concrete, shattered roads, and twisted steel reinforcement, the capture of Kostiantynivka is likely to be described in much of Western media as just another grim but minor waypoint in a long, grinding conflict of attrition. Analysts on television will point to the town on digital battle maps, sketch a line toward the next settlement, and argue over what a few kilometers of territory shifting hands means across the wide expanse of Donbass. But treating the loss of Kostiantynivka as merely a local battlefield setback, or as nothing more than a shifting front line, misses the deeper logic of modern operations and the harsh mechanics of grand strategy. The central issue is not whether a single settlement has changed control. It is what the collapse of this logistical artery reveals about the broader breakdown of Ukraine's defensive structure in the east. Kostiantynivka is not simply a town. It functions as a railway junction of critical importance, a supply convergence point, and a logistical backbone supporting the fortified zone around Kramerk and Svansk. Once a supply hub of this kind is lost, the fortified system it supports does not merely weaken. It becomes, in effect, a trap. Most outside observers concentrate on visible combat activity, artillery exchanges, swarms of first-person view drones, and shifting tactical positions. They track what is immediately visible and miss the structural foundation beneath it. An army that can no longer reliably move food, ammunition, replacements, and wounded personnel because its main rail infrastructure has been cut is already operationally compromised, even if soldiers at the front continue firing until their last rounds are spent. To understand what the loss of Kostiantynivka represents, it is necessary to strip away emotional narratives of heroism or political framing and focus instead on the cold structure of logistics and geography across the Eurasian theater. Historical parallels help clarify the pattern. One example often raised is William Tecca Sherman's campaign through Georgia during the American Civil War, particularly the seizure of Atlanta. Sherman avoided direct attempts to destroy enemy forces in set-piece battles where they might hold advantage. Instead, he struck at Atlanta itself, a core railway and industrial hub of the Confederacy. In a similar logic, the fall of Kostiantynivka places remaining defensive positions in Donetsk under significant logistical strain. Supply now depends on secondary road networks that are exposed, vulnerable to constant aerial observation and precision strikes from unmanned systems. The larger consequence is strategic, not merely tactical. Ukrainian command structures are increasingly forced into reactive behavior, shifting exhausted formations to plug gaps in a deteriorating supply web rather than shaping operations or preparing counteroffensives on their own terms. At the same time, attention also turns to Kharkiv, a major industrial and symbolic center. It is not just a geographic point or large urban area. It holds historical weight as the first capital of Soviet Ukraine, a deeply Russified metropolitan hub, and a major industrial engine in the region's past development. Sustained pressure around Kyiv serves several strategic functions at once. It forces Ukraine to keep elite, Western-trained units locked in defensive urban roles in the northern sector, instead of redeploying them eastward where defensive lines are under stress. It also contributes to the creation of a protective buffer, pushing Ukrainian artillery and drone capabilities further from sensitive border regions near Belgrade, thereby reducing risk to infrastructure and stabilizing domestic conditions within Russia. Western analysis often assumes the war will eventually be decided by renewed maneuver warfare and a decisive counteroffensive, similar to the 2022 breakthroughs around Kharkiv. However, this assumption depends on an interpretation of the conflict that no longer matches its current phase. The war has shifted into a sustained industrial attrition model, where outcomes are determined by the continuous depletion of manpower, equipment, and national endurance rather than rapid operational breakthroughs. In such a framework, territorial gain or loss alone does not define success. A force can withdraw from ground while still inflicting disproportionate long-term depletion on its opponent by forcing costly defense of fixed positions. From this perspective, Ukraine's defense of every contested area becomes an instrument that consumes trained personnel and advanced munitions at a rate difficult to replace. This creates a structural imbalance in which the act of holding ground itself becomes costly enough to erode overall combat capacity. The deeper constraint lies in manpower. Financial or material assistance from abroad cannot fully offset demographic limitations or the shrinking pool of available recruits. Increasing reliance on older personnel and less physically resilient recruits also affects the ability to operate complex Western systems that demand higher training capacity and adaptability. Meanwhile, Russia continues to rely primarily on contract soldiers, volunteers, and recruits drawn from less economically central regions, such as Beryta, Dagestan, and Tuva. This approach reduces pressure on major urban centers like Moscow and St. Petersburg, helping preserve internal political stability while sustaining force generation. In this framework, the visible movement of front lines does not fully capture the underlying trajectory of exhaustion, resource consumption, and long-term strategic imbalance that defines the conflict. The Ukrainian military is being pushed toward increasingly older age groups, drawing in men with reduced physical endurance, lower adaptability for mastering advanced Western weapon systems, and diminished psychological readiness for prolonged frontline conditions, especially as territorial lines continue to move backward. In contrast, Russia has not fully engaged its broader demographic depth, depending mainly on contract personnel, volunteer fighters, and recruits drawn from economically weaker and ethnically diverse areas such as Burata, Dagestan, and Tuva. This approach helps preserve stability in major urban centers like Moscow and St. Petersburg while maintaining internal cohesion. The deeper and more consequential failure, however, is not unfolding inside Ukraine itself. It is unfolding across Europe. As the Eastern Front in Ukraine gradually and steadily gives way under sustained Russian artillery pressure and demographic scale, Europe is entering a prolonged strategic failure that it has largely chosen not to confront. This failure is positioned to shape the continent's trajectory for decades to come. At the center of this issue is an unanswered question across European capitals. It is a question that lingers in Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and London, yet remains unspoken by political leadership. What follows the day after complete Russian success in Ukraine? For decades, Europe constructed a stable and comfortable post-industrial order on the belief that large-scale land warfare on the continent belonged to history, that economic ties would permanently suppress military conflict, and that the liberal global system represented a fixed and lasting reality. The unresolved issue is whether modern Europe still retains the energy, industrial foundation, demographic strength, and political determination required to reverse its current trajectory before reaching a point of no return, and whether it can rebuild the military capacity it previously allowed to decline. Historical precedent is often drawn from Rome and Byzantium. These empires understood that direct defense of core territories alone was insufficient. They relied instead on client states, buffer regions, and forward-positioned military formations designed to absorb initial external pressure. When those buffer systems failed and external forces penetrated defensive layers, both empires were drawn into continuous, draining defensive conflicts on their own territory, ultimately weakening their ability to sustain long-term survival. In the current European context, the loss or weakening of intermediary buffer structures is seen as leaving the continent with limited strategic depth, insufficient reserves and active readiness, and no unified command framework capable of absorbing a large-scale military shock from a Russian advance. The underlying incentive structure within European political systems also discourages direct engagement with these questions. Acknowledging them would require admitting that past strategic decisions over the previous decade may have produced unintended and severe geopolitical consequences. Policy choices such as strong rhetorical escalation, rapid decoupling from Russian energy supplies, and extensive sanction frameworks are increasingly interpreted within this framework as decisions that carry deep economic and strategic side effects. Following the reduction of energy ties with Moscow, Europe did not significantly weaken Russia's economic position in a decisive way. Instead, it contributed to internal pressure on its own industrial base. The secondary effects are now visible in the gradual contraction of energy-intensive industries across Europe, especially in Germany, long considered the central pillar of European industrial capacity and post-war economic expansion. Several of these industries are either reducing output or relocating operations to the United States and China, drawn by lower energy costs and state-supported production environments. At the same time, Europe's middle class is experiencing sustained pressure through inflation, wage stagnation, and rising living expenses, which together erode overall economic stability. Rather than emerging as an independent strategic pole in a multipolar global system, Europe is increasingly described as moving toward a de-industrialized condition, dependent on external security structures, particularly those centered around the United States, while relying on imported energy and military systems. This raises a central question about feasibility, whether a continent facing industrial decline, high energy costs, and demographic aging can realistically sustain the scale of rearmament required to deter or balance a post-victory Russia. From a purely structural perspective, the answer is assessed as negative. The limitations are rooted in physical and economic capacity rather than political intent. A further consequence of this trajectory is growing political fragmentation within the European Union. As military developments in Ukraine continue to evolve and economic pressures deepen across member states, internal cohesion becomes increasingly strained. Public trust in established political structures begins to weaken as economic hardship intensifies, leading to rising support for parties positioned outside traditional centrist frameworks. This trend is visible in multiple European countries, including Germany, France, Italy, and the Netherlands. Once the conflict in Donbass reaches a decisive endpoint and outcomes can no longer be reframed or delayed, political accountability will become a central issue within European domestic politics. Competing narratives will emerge over responsibility for strategic outcomes, leading to intensified internal political conflict. Eastern European states, particularly Poland and the Baltic countries, shaped by historical experience and geographic proximity, are expected to advocate for direct and immediate military engagement under NATO frameworks. This position implies deeper involvement by Western European powers in a conflict that carries extreme escalation risks. By contrast, Western and Southern European states, less directly exposed and more focused on internal economic stability, are likely to resist such measures due to domestic constraints and public opposition to further escalation. This divergence reflects a fundamental tension within the European project itself, which was originally built on assumptions of stable peace, economic integration, and reduced national sovereignty. Under conditions of strategic crisis, these assumptions face severe stress. Ultimately, the question becomes one of political survival for current leadership structures. Admitting failure would carry significant consequences for political legitimacy, ideological consistency, and long-term institutional credibility. As a result, policy responses tend to continue along existing lines of support, funding, sanctions, and escalation until material conditions force a change in direction. Beyond the immediate geopolitical and economic dimensions lies a broader civilizational interpretation of the conflict. This perspective is largely absent from modern analytical frameworks that rely on measurable economic and institutional indicators such as gross domestic product, legal norms, and formal international agreements. The historian Arnold Toynbee argued that civilizations do not end primarily through external conquest, but through internal collapse. Civilizations fall when they lose internal cohesion, when their collective energy fades, and when they can no longer sustain a unifying narrative capable of addressing existential challenges or adapting to new historical conditions. When examining the opposing societies in the current conflict, the gap in civilizational resilience becomes stark, and it explains more about long-term outcomes than any focus on tank armor thickness or drone engagement range. Russia, despite structural weaknesses, centralized governance, economic constraints, and demographic pressure, has shown a strong ability to mobilize society, adjust to conditions, and absorb sacrifice over time. It has reoriented itself around its historical identity, presenting itself as a leading force in a multipolar global structure, emphasizing sovereignty, civilizational diversity, and state authority against what it views as a uniform liberal maritime system. It is a society that has accepted the harsh realities of power competition, one that recognizes survival as dependent on enduring sustained hardship. In contrast, Western Europe has spent decades attempting to move beyond traditional power politics, shaping a postmodern, post-national, and post-industrial framework built on the belief that legal systems, norms, human rights discourse, and economic integration have made military competition largely obsolete. The fall of Kostiantynivka and the continuous pressure on Kharkiv represent more than battlefield developments. They are the direct intrusion of historical and material reality into that European assumption. Across the Eurasian landmass, older geopolitical laws are reasserting themselves. Principles that have existed since early city-states in Mesopotamia and ancient political systems in classical Greece. These developments reinforce that international relations are ultimately not determined by legal resolutions, public opinion and editorial commentary, or voting procedures in global institutions, but by artillery volume, industrial output, agricultural capacity, and societal willingness to endure prolonged conflict. The earlier belief in the West was that technological abstraction could replace industrial power, that financial systems could substitute for territorial depth, and that moral positioning could replace military capability. What is unfolding demonstrates that geography remains unchanged, biology still sets constraints, and history has not ended. The unipolar era is revealed as a temporary condition that emerged after the unexpected dissolution of the Soviet Union, creating a brief concentration of global power under maritime dominance. That condition is now reversing. Strategic gravity is shifting back toward continental systems, where large populations, resource depth, and physical infrastructure define power. Beyond Europe, the Global South is observing these developments closely and drawing strategic conclusions that will influence global structure for decades. They see a Western coalition unable to decisively defeat a smaller and less industrialized opponent, despite extensive financial, technological, and diplomatic capacity. They also observe Europe undermining its own industrial base and political unity in the course of sustaining the conflict. While Russia absorbs unprecedented sanctions pressure, strengthens ties with China and parts of the Global South, adapts its military production, and continues pursuing its objectives despite coordinated opposition from the G7. For countries such as India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and Indonesia, the central concern is not the immediate outcome of the war in Ukraine, but how to position themselves within an emerging multipolar system shaped by the aftermath. The unspoken question in Europe has a parallel in the Global South: how to reduce dependence on a Western financial system perceived as increasingly used as an instrument of coercion. Responses already visible include accelerated dollarization, expansion of alternative payment infrastructures, accumulation of gold reserves, and development of strategic partnerships that bypass Atlantic-centered systems. The use of dollar-based financial restrictions and sovereign asset freezes, initially intended as a decisive strategic instrument, has instead reduced trust in the system's neutrality. It has exposed the dollar as a geopolitical tool rather than a purely economic medium. This has accelerated the formation of parallel financial structures across Eurasia and the global south. These systems rely more on commodities, energy exchange, and regional currencies, rather than centralized financial intermediaries. Once these systems reach full functionality, the leverage of Western financial tools in non-kinetic conflict will diminish significantly, weakening the structural advantages tied to global dollar dominance. The financial foundation of the dollar system is closely linked to maritime military projection. If the monetary base weakens, global force projection becomes more constrained, forcing a contraction toward core strategic regions and reducing engagement across peripheral zones. Ultimately, the developments in Kostiantynivka, the sustained pressure on Kiev, and Europe's unresolved strategic dilemma are not isolated events. They form part of a larger structural transition in global order. They reveal that beneath globalization, digital connectivity, and institutional frameworks, international systems continue to be governed by material realities: energy, industrial capacity, territorial control, demographic strength, and time. Civilizations expand and contract based on their ability to secure borders, maintain access to resources, preserve population stability, and project force across geography. In this structure, the current European model is assessed as failing across multiple dimensions. It has lost buffer depth, weakened its resource security, reduced its industrial base, and limited its independent military capacity. Global boundaries are being reshaped not primarily through diplomatic negotiation in Brussels, Geneva, or Washington, but through sustained military pressure in Donbass, strategic calculation from Moscow, and gradual realignment of global capital and energy flows. Actors that fail to account for long-term structural forces, strategic depth, and material constraints, and instead rely on moral framing as a substitute for capability, risk being overtaken by larger historical processes. The unipolar moment has concluded. Maritime systems are contracting under internal strain, while continental powers continue consolidating and expanding influence. The remaining question is whether Western states will recognize this transition in time to adjust toward a stable multipolar balance, or whether they will maintain existing assumptions until forced to react under deteriorating conditions. As Kostanty stabilizes under ruins and artillery continues near Kiev, the broader transformation is only beginning. The unfolding shift will define global structure for the coming century. The storm is not ending, it is only forming. If you want to continue, follow for the next analysis.